Lie back, put your headphones in, snuggle in tight. Are you all ready? Then let me read you a bedtime story, my dears. Let's begin. Horror in the Museum by H.P. Lovecraft for Hazel Heald. It was languid curiosity which first brought Stephen Jones to Rogers' Museum. Someone had told him about the queer underground place in Southwark Street across the river, where waxen things so much more horrible than the worst effigies at Madame Tussaud's were shewn. And he strolled in one day in April to see how disappointing he would find it. Oddly, he was not disappointed. There was something different and distinctive here. After all, of course, the usual gory commonplace was present. Landru, Dr. Crippen, Madame Demers, Rizzio, Lady Jane Grey, endless maimed victims of war and revolution, and monsters like Gilles de Rais and the Marquis de Sade. But there were other things which had made him breathe faster and stay till the ringing of the closed bell. The man who had fashioned his collection could be no ordinary mountebank. There was imagination, even a kind of diseased genius in some of this stuff. Later he had learned about George Rogers. The man had been on Tussaud's staff, but some trouble had developed which led to his discharge. There were aspirations on his sanity and tales of his crazy forms of secret worship, though latterly his success with his own basement museum had dulled the edges of some criticisms which sharpening the insidious points of others. Teratology and the iconography of nightmare were his hobbies, and even he had the prudence to screen off some of his worst effigies in a special alcove for adults only. It was this alcove which had fascinated Jones so much. There were lumpish hybrid things which only fantasy could spawn, molded with devilish skill and colored in horribly lifelike fashion. Some were figures of well-known myth, gorgons, chimeras, dragons, cyclops, and all their shuddersome conigers. Others were drawn from darker and more furtively whispered cycles of subterranean legend. Black, formless, Gua, many-tentacled Cthulhu, Proboscidean, Changur, Ebion, Faugan, and other rumored blasphemies from forbidden books like the Necronomicon and the Book of Ebion, or the Unauspicial Kulin of von Yurtzen. But the worst were wholly original with Rogers, and represented shape which no tale of antiquity had ever dared to suggest. Several were hideous parodies on forms of organic life we know, while others seemed taken from feverish dreams of other planets and other galaxies. The wilder paintings of Clark Ashton Smith might suggest a few, but nothing could suggest the effect of poignant, loathsome terror created by their great size and fiendish cunning workmanship, and by the diabolically clever lighting conditions under which they were exhibited. Stephen Jones, as a leisurely connoisseur of the bizarre in art, had sought out Rogers himself in the dingy office and workroom behind the vaulted museum chamber, an evil-looking crypt lighted dimly by dusty windows sat slit-like and horizontal in the brick wall on a level with the ancient cobblestones of hidden courtyards. It was here that the images were repaired. Here, too, where some of them had been made. Waxen arms, legs, heads, and torsos lay in grotesque array. On various benches, while on high tiers of shelves, matted wigs, ravenous-looking teeth, and glassy staring eyes were indiscriminately scattered. Costumes of all sorts hung from hooks, and in one alcove were great piles of flesh-covered wax cakes, and shelves filled with paint cans and brushes of every description. In the center of the room was a large melting furnace used to prepare the wax for molding. Its firebox topped by a huge iron container on hinges with a spout which permitted the pouring of melted wax with the merest touch of a finger. Other things in the dismal crypt were less describable. Isolated parts of problematic entities whose assembled forms were the phantoms of delirium. At one end was a door of heavy plank, fastened by an unusually large padlock, and with a very peculiar symbol painted over it. Jones, who had once had access to the dreaded Necronomicon, shivered involuntarily as he recognized that symbol. This showman, he reflected, must indeed be a person of disconcertingly wide scholarship in dark and dubious fields. Nor did the conversation with Rogers disappoint him. The man was tall, lean, and rather unkempt, with large black eyes which gazed combustively from a pallid and usually stubble-covered face. He did not resent Jones's intrusion, but seemed to welcome the chance of unburdening himself to an interested person. His voice was of singular depth and resonance, and harbored a sort of repressed intensity bordering on the feverish. Jones did not wonder that many had thought him mad. With every successive call, and such calls became a habit as the weeks went by, Jones found Rogers more communicative and confidential. From the first there had been hints of strange faiths and practices on the showman's part, and later on these hints expanded into tales, despite a few corroborative photographs whose extravagance was almost cosmic. It was sometime in June, on a night when Jones had brought a bottle of good whiskey and plied his host somewhat freely, that the really demented talk first appeared. Before that, there had been wild enough stories, accounts of mysterious trips to Tibet, the African interior, the Arabian desert, the Amazon Valley, Alaska, and certain little-known islands of the South Pacific, plus claims of having read such monstrous and half-fabulous books as the prehistoric Ptolemaic Fragment and the De Whole Chants attributed to malign and non-human Lang. But nothing in all of this had been so unmistakably insane as what had cropped out of that June evening under the spell of the whiskey. To be plain, Roger began making vague boasts of having found certain things in nature that no one had found before, and of having brought back tangible evidence of such discoveries. According to his bilious harangue, he had gone farther than anyone else in interpreting the obscure and primal books he studied, and had been directed by them to certain remote places where strange survivals are hidden, survivals of eons and life cycles earlier than mankind. and in some cases connected with other dimensions and other worlds, communication with which was frequent in the forgotten pre-human days. Jones marveled at the fancy which he could conjure up such notions, and wondered just what Roger's mental history had been. Had his work amidst the morbid grotesqueries of Madame Tussauds been the start of his imaginative flights? Or was it the tendency innate, so that his choice of occupation was merely one of its manifestations? At any rate, the man's work was very closely linked with his notions. Even now, there was no mistaking the tread of his blackest hints about the nightmare monstrosities in the screened-off, adult-only alcove. Heedless of ridicule, he was trying to imply that not all of these demonic abnormalities were artificial. It was Jones's frank skepticism and amusement at these irresponsible claims which broke up the growing cordiality. Rogers, it was clear, took himself very seriously, for he now became morose and resentful, continuing to tolerate Jones only through a dogged urge to break down his wall of urbane and complacent incredulity. Wild tales and suggestions of rites and sacrifices to nameless elder gods continued, and now and then Roger would lead his guest to one of the hideous blasphemies in the screened-off alcove and point out features difficult to reconcile with even the finest human craftsmanship. Jones continued his visits through sheer fascination, though he knew he had forfeited his host's regard. At times he would try to humor Rogers with pretended assent to some mad hint or assertion, but the gaunt showman was seldom to be deceived by such tactics. The tension came to a head later in September. Jones had casually dropped into the museum one afternoon and was wandering through the dim corridors whose horrors were now so familiar, when he heard a very peculiar sound from the direction of Roger's workroom. Others heard it too, and started nervously as the echoes reverberated through the great vaulted basement. The three attendants exchanged odd glances, and one of them, a dark, taciturn, foreign-looking fellow who always served Rogers as a repairer and assistant designer, smiled in a way which seemed to puzzle his colleagues, and which grated very harshly on some facet of Jones's sensibility. It was the yelp or screams of a dog, and was such a sound as could be made only under conditions of utmost fright and agony combined. Its stark, anguished frenzy was appalling to hear, and this setting of grotesque abnormalities, it held a double hideousness. Jones remembered that no dogs were allowed in the museum. He was about to go to the door leading to the workroom, when the dark attendant stopped him with a word and a gesture. "Mr. Rogers," the man said in a soft, somewhat accented voice, at once apologetic and vaguely sardonic, was out, and there were standing orders to admit no one to the workroom during his absence. As for that yelp, it was undoubtedly something in the courtyard behind the museum. This neighborhood was full of stray mongrels, and their fights were sometimes shockingly noisy. There was no dogs in any part of the museum, but if Mr. Jones wished to see Mr. Rogers, he might find him just before closing time. After this, Jones climbed the old stone steps to the street outside, and examined the squalid neighborhood curiously. The leaning, decrepit buildings, once dwellings, but now largely shops and warehouses, were very ancient indeed. Some of them were of a gabled type, seeming to go back to Tudor times, and a faint miasmic stench hung subtly about the whole region. Besides the dingy house whose basement held the museum, was a low archway pierced by a dark cobbled alley, and this Jones entered in a vague wish to find the courtyard behind the workroom, and settle the affairs of the dog more comfortably in his mind. The courtyard was dim in the late afternoon light, hemmed in by rear walls, even uglier and more intangibly menacing than the crumbling street facade of the evil old houses. Not a dog was in sight, and Jones wondered how the aftermath of such a frantic turmoil could have completely vanished so soon. Despite the assistant's statement that no dog had been in the museum, Jones glanced nervously at the 3 small windows of the basement workroom, narrow, horizontal rectangles close to the grass-grown pavement, with grimy panes that stared repulsively and incuriously like the eyes of dead fish. To their left, a worn flight of steps led to an opaque and heavy bolted door. Some impulse urged him to crouch low on the damp, broken cobblestones and peer in, on the chance that the thick green shades, worked by long cords that hung down to a reachable level, might not be drawn. The outer surface were thick with dirt, but he rubbed them with a handkerchief. He saw there was no obscuring curtain in the way of his vision. So shadowed was the cellar from the inside that not much could be made out, but the grotesque working paraphernalia now that loomed up spectrally as Jones tried each of the windows in turn. It seemed evident at first that no one was within, yet when he peered through the extreme right-hand window, the one nearest the entrance alley, he saw a glow of light at the farthest end of the apartment, which made him pause in bewilderment. There was no reason why any light should be there. It was an inner side of the room, and he could not recall any gas or electric fixture near that point. Another look defined that glow as a large vertical rectangle, and a thought occurred to him. It was in that direction he had always noticed the heavy plank door with the abnormally large padlock, the door which was never opened, and above which was crudely smeared that hideous cryptic symbol from the fragmentary records of forbidden elder magic. It must be open now, and there was a light inside. All his former speculation as to where the door led and as to what lay behind it were now renewed with trembly disquieting force. Jones wandered aimlessly around the dismal locality till close to 6 o'clock, when he returned to the museum to make the call on Rogers. He could hardly tell why he wished so especially to see the man just then, but there must have been some subconscious misgivings about the terrible, unplaceable canine scream in the afternoon, and about the glow of light in that disturbing and usually unopened inner doorway with the heavy padlock. The attendants were leaving as he arrived, and he thought that Orabona, the dark, foreign-looking assistant, eyed him with something like sly, repressed amusement. He did not relish that look, even though he had seen the fellow turn it on his employer many times. The vaulted exhibition room was ghoulish in its desertion, but he strode quickly through it and rapped at the door of the office and workroom. response was slow in coming, though there were footsteps inside. Finally, in response to a second knock, the lock rattled, and the ancient, six-paneled portal creaked reluctantly open to reveal the slouching, feverish-eyed form of George Rogers. From the first, it was clear that the showman was in an unusual mood. There was a curious mixture of reluctance and actual gloating in his welcome, and his talk at once veered to extravagances of the most hideous and incredible sort. Surviving elder gods, nameless sacrifices, the other-than-artificial nature of some of the alcove horrors, all the usual boasts, but uttered in a tone of peculiarity, increasing confidence. Obviously, Jones reflected, the poor fellow's madness was gaining on him. From time to time, Rogers would send furtive glances towards the heavy padlocked inner door at the end of the room, or towards a piece of coarse burlap on the floor not far from it, beneath which some small object appeared to be lying. Jones grew more nervous as the moments passed, and began to feel as hesitant about mentioning the afternoon's oddities as he had formerly been anxious to do so. Roger's sepulchrally resonant bass almost cracked under the excitement of his fevered rambling. "Do you remember," he shouted, "what I told you about that ruined city in Indochina where the Toko lived? You had to admit I'd been there when you saw the photographs, even if you did think I made the oblong swimmer in the darkness out of wax. If you'd seen it writhing in the underground pools, as I did. Well, this is bigger still. I never told you about this because I wanted to work out the later parts before making any claim. When you see in the snapshots, you'll know the geography couldn't have been faked, and I fancy I have another way of proving that it isn't any waxed concoction of mine. You've never seen it, for the experiments wouldn't let me keep it on exhibit." The showman glanced queerly at the padlocked door. "It all comes from that long ritual in the 8th Namek fragment. When I got it figured out, I saw I could have one meaning. There were things in the north before the land of Lamar, before mankind existed, but the thing was there as we knew it would be. Great Cyclopsian ruins, acres of them. There were less left than we'd hoped for, but after 3 million years, what could one expect?" There weren't the Esquimau legends all in the right direction. We couldn't get one of the beggars to go up with us and had to sledge all the way to Nome for Americans. Orabana was no good up in that climate. It made him sullen and hateful. I'll tell you later how we found it. When we got to the ice blasted out of the pylons on the central ruin, the stairway was just as we knew it would be. Some carvings still there, and it was no trouble keeping the Yankees from following us in. Orabana shivered like a leaf. You'd never think it from the damned insolent way he struts around. He knew enough of the Elder Lord to be properly afraid. The eternal light was gone, but our torches shewed enough. We saw the bones of others who had been before us, eons ago, when the climate was warm. Some of those bones were of things you couldn't even imagine. At the 3rd level down, we found the ivory throne the fragment said so much about, and I may well tell you, it wasn't empty. The thing on that throne didn't move, and we knew then that it needed the nourishment of sacrifice. But we didn't want to wake it then. Better to get it to London first. Orabana and I went to the surface for the big box. But when we had it packed, we couldn't get it up 3 flights of steps. These steps weren't made for human beings. Their size bothered us. Anyway, it was devilishly heavy. We had to have the Americans down to get it out. They weren't anxious to go into the place, but of course the worst thing was safely inside the box. We told them it was a batch of ivory carvings, archaeological stuff. And after seeing the carved throne, they probably believed us. It's a wonder they didn't suspect hidden treasure and demand a share. They must have told queer tales around Nome later on, though I doubt if they ever went back to those ruins, even for the ivory throne. Roger paused, felt around in his desk, and produced an envelope of good-sized photographic prints. Extracting one and laying it face down before him, he handed the rest to Jones. The set was certainly an odd one. Ice-clad hills, dog sleds, men in furs, and vast tumbled ruins against a background of snow. Ruins whose bizarre outline and enormous stone blocks could hardly be accounted for. One flashlight view showed an incredible interior chamber with wild carvings and a curious throne, whose proposition could not have been deigned for a human occupant. The carvings on the gigantic masonry, high walls and peculiar vaulting overhead, were mainly symbolic and involved both wholly unknown designs and certain hieroglyphs darkly cited in obscure legend. Over the throne loomed the same dreadful symbol which was now painted on the workroom wall above the padlocked plank door. Jones darted a nervous glance at the closed portal. Assuredly, Roger had been to strange places and seen strange things. Yet this mad interior picture might easily be a fraud, taken from a clever stage setting. One must not be too credulous. But Roger was continuing. Well, we shipped the box from Nome and got to London without any trouble. It was the first time we'd brought back anything that had a chance of coming alive. I didn't put it on display because there were more important things to do for it. It needed nourishment of sacrifice. For it was a god. Of course, I couldn't get the sort of sacrifice which it used to have in its day, for such things don't exist now. But there were other things which might do. The blood is the life, you know. Even the lemurs and elementals that are older than the earth will come when the blood of men or beast is offered under the right conditions. The expression of the narrator's face was growing very alarming and repulsive, so that Jones fidgeted involuntarily in his chair. Roger seemed to notice his guest's nervousness and continued with a distinctively evil smile. It was the last year that I got it, and ever since then I've been trying rites and sacrifices. Orabana hasn't been much help, for he's always against the idea of waking it. He hates it, probably because he's afraid of what it will come to mean. He carries a pistol at all times to protect himself. Fool. As if there were human protection against it. If I ever see him draw that pistol, I'll strangle him. He wanted me to kill it and make an effigy of it. But I've stuck to my plans, and I'm coming out on top in spite of all the cowards like Orabana. And damned sniggering skeptics like you, Jones. I've chanted the rites and made certain sacrifices, and last week the transition came. The sacrifice was received and enjoyed. Rogers actually licked his lips while Jones held himself uneasily rigid. The showman paused, and rose, crossing the room to the piece of burlap at which he glanced so often. Bending down, he took hold of one corner as he spoke again. "You've laughed enough at my work. Now it's time for you to get some facts. Orabana tells me you heard a dog screaming around here this afternoon. Do you know what that meant?" Jones stared. For all his curiosity, he would have been glad to get out without further light on the point which had so puzzled him. But Roger was inexorable and began to lift the square of burlap. Beneath it lay a crushed, almost shapeless mass, which Jones was slow to classify. Was it a once living thing which some agency had flattened, sucked dry of blood, punctured in 1,000 places, and wrung into a limp, broken-boned heap of grotesqueness? After a moment, Joan realized what it must be. It was what was left of a dog, perhaps of considerable size and whitish color. Its breed was past recognition, for distortion had come in nameless and hideous ways. Most of the hair was burnt off, as if by some pungent acid, and the exposed, bloodless skin was riddled by innumerable circular wounds or incisions. The form of torture necessary to cause such results was past imagining. Electrified with a pure loathing which conjured his mounting disgust, Jones sprang up with a cry. "You damned sadist! You madman! You do a thing like this and dare to speak to a decent man!" Rogers dropped the burlap with a malign sneer and faced his oncoming guest. His words held an unnatural calm. "Why, you fool, do you think I did this? Let us admit that the results are unbeautiful from our limited human standpoint. What of it? It's not human and does not pretend to be. To sacrifice is merely to offer. I gave the dog to it. What happened is its work, not mine. It needed the nourishment of the offering and took it in its own way. Museuem. But let me show you what it looks like." Hazel healed. As Jones stood hesitatingly, the speaker returned to his desk and took up the photograph he had laid face down without chewing. Someone had told him. Now he extended it with a curious look. Jones took it up and glanced at it in an almost mechanical way. After a moment, the visitor's glance became sharper and more observed, for the utter satanic force of the object depicted had an almost hypnotic effect. Certainly Rogers had outdone himself in modeling the eldritch nightmare which the camera had caught. The thing was a work of sheer infernal genius, and Jones wondered how the public would react when it was placed on exhibition. So hideous a thing had no right to exist. Probably the mere contemplation of it, after it was done, had completed the unhinging of its maker's mind and led him to worship it with brutal sacrifices. Only a stout sanity could resist the insidious suggestion that the blasphemy was or had once been some morbid and exotic form of actual life. The thing in the picture squatted or was balanced on what appered to be a clever reproduction of the monstrous carved throne in the other curious photograph. To describe it with any ordinary vocabulary would be impossible. for nothing even
latterly
roughly
his success with
corresponded
his
to
own
it
basement
had ever
museum
come
had
within the
dulled the
imagination
edges of some
of
criticisms
sane
which,
mankind.
sharpening the
It
insidious
represented
points of
something
others.
meant perhaps to be roughly
Teratology
connected
and the
with the
iconography
vertebrates of this
nightmare
planet,
were his hobbies.
though one could not be too sure
and even
of that.
he had the prudence to
Its
screen off
bulk
some
was
of his worst
cyclopsian,
effigies.
for even squatted it
special
towered
alcove
to
for
almost
adults
twice
only.
the height
It was
of
this
Orabana,
alcove which had
who was
fascinated
shewn
Jones
beside
so
it.
much.
Looking
There
sharply,
were lumpish
one might
hybrid
trace
things
its
which
approximation
fantasy can
towards the
spawn,
bodily features
molded with
of the higher
devilish skill
vertebrates.
and colored in
There was an almost
horribly
globular
lifelike
torso
fashion.
with 6
Some were
long,
figures of
sinuous
well-known men,
limbs, terminating in
Gorgons,
crab-like
chimeras,
claws.
dragons, cyclops,
From the upper end,
and all their
a
shuddersome
subsidiary
conigueras.
globe bulged
Others
forward,
were drawn from
bubble-like.
darker and
Its
more
triangle of 3
furtively
staring,
whispered cycles
fishy
of
eyes,
subterranean legend.
its foot-long
Black,
and evidently
formless,
flexible
Gua,
proboscis and distended lateral
tentacled
system
Cthulhu,
analogous to gills suggested that it was a head.
Changur,
Most of the body was
Evion,
covered with what at first appeared to be
Faurin,
fur,
and other
but which on closer
rumored
examination
blasphemies
proved
from
to be
forbidden books
a
like
dense
the
growth of dark,
Necronomicon,
slender
Book of
tentacles or
Evion,
sucking
or
filaments, each tipped with a mouth suggesting the head of an ass.
Of Von
On the head
Yurtsny,
and below the
but the
traditional
worst were wholly
serpent
original
locks
with
of
Rogers,
Medusa.
and
To say that
represented
such a
shape
thing
which no
could
tale
have
of
an
antiquity
expression
had ever dared
seemed
to suggest.
paradoxical.
Several were hideous
Yet Jones
parodies
felt
on
that the
forms
triangle of
organic life we
bulging
know,
fish eyes that had
while others seemed
obliquely
taken
posed
from feverish
proboscis
dreams of
all
other
bespoke
planets
a
and
blend
other
of
galaxies.
greed,
The wilder
and
paintings
sheer
of
cruelty,
Clark Ashton Smith
incomprehensible
might
to
suggest a few,
mankind,
but nothing
because
could
mixed
suggest
with
the
other
effect of
emotions,
poignant,
not of the world
loathsome
or of
terror
this solar
created by their
system,
great size
into
and
this bestial
fiendish cunning
abnormality he
workmanship,
reflected.
and by the
Rogers must have
diabolically clever
poured at
lighting
once
conditions under which
all
they were
his maligned
exhibited.
insanity
Stephen
and
Jones,
all his
as a
uncanny
leisurely connoisseur of the
sculptural
bizarre and
genius.
art, had sought out
The
Rogers
thing was
himself
incredible,
in the dingy office
and yet
and
the
workroom
photograph
behind the
proved
vaulted
that it
museum
existed.
chamber. An
Rogers
evil-looking crypt,
interrupted his
lighted
reveries.
dimly by dusty
Well,
windows.
what do you think of
sat
it?
slit-like
Now do
and
you wonder what
horizontal in
crushed
the
the
brick
dog and
wall on
sucked
a
it
level
dry with
the
a
ancient
million
cobblestones
mouths?
of hidden
It
courtyards.
needed nourishment, and
was here
it
that
will
the
need
images were
more.
repaired.
Is it a god?
Here, too, where some
And
of them had been
I,
made.
the first priest
Waxen arms,
of its latter-day
legs,
hierarchy.
heads and torsos lay in grotesque array on various benches, while on high tiers of shelves,
Nagrotha,
matted wigs,
the goat
rabbit
with 1,000
teeth,
young.
and glassy staring
Jones
eyes were
lowered the photograph in
indiscriminately
disgust
scattered.
and pity.
Costumes of all sorts hung from hooks, and in one
See here,
alcove were
Rogers,
great
this won't
piles
do.
of
There are limits,
fresh-covered
you
wax
know.
cakes,
It's a
and
great
shelves
piece of
filled
work
with
and
paint
all, but
cans and brushes of
it isn't
every
good for
description.
you. Better
In the
not
center
see
of
it
the room
anymore. Let
was a large
Orabana
melting
break it up
furnace
and try to forget
used to
about
prepare
it.
the wax
Let me
for
tear this
molding.
beastly picture up,
Its
too.
firebox
With a
topped by
snarl,
huge
Rogers
iron
snatched the
container on
photograph and
hinges
returned it to the
with a
desk.
spout
Idiot!
which permitted the pouring of
You,
melted wax
and you
with the
still
merest
think
touch
it's all
of
a
finger.
fraud. You
Other
still think I
things in the
made it,
dismal
and you
crypt
still think my
were
figures are
less
nothing but
describable.
lifeless wax.
Isolated
Why,
parts of
damn you, you're the
problematic
worst
entities
clod than a
whose
wax
assembled
image
forms
yourself.
were the
But I've
phantoms
got
of
proof this
delirium.
time, and
At
you're
one end was
going
a
to
door of
know.
heavy plank,
Not just now,
fastened by
for it's
an
resting
unusually
after the
large
sacrifice,
padlock,
but later.
and with a
Oh,
very
yes,
peculiar
you will
symbol
not
painted
doubt
over it.
the power of it then.
Jones, who had once
As Rogers
had
glanced
access
towards
to
the
dreaded
padlock inner door,
Necronomicon,
Jones retrieved his hat and
shivered
stick from a nearby
involuntarily as
bench.
he recognized that
Very well,
symbol.
Rogers. Let it be
This
later.
showman, he reflected,
I must be going now, but I'll call
must
around tomorrow
indeed be a
afternoon.
person of
Think my advice over
disconcertingly wide
and see if it doesn't sound
scholarship in
sensible.
dark and
Ask
dubious
Orabana what he
fields.
thinks too.
Nor did the
Rogers
conversation
actually
with
bared
Rogers
his teeth
disappoint
in
him.
wild
The man
beast
was
fashion.
tall, lean, and
Must
rather
be going
unkempt,
now, eh?
with large
Afraid,
black
after
eyes
all
which
the afraid for all your bold talk. You say the effigies are only wax, yet you run away when I begin to prove that they aren't.
But seemed to welcome
You are like the fellows who take my standing bet that they daren't spend the night in the museum. Oh, they come boldly enough, but after an hour they shriek and hammer to get out. Want me to ask Orabana, eh? You two, always against me. You want to break down the coming earthly reign of it. Jones persevered his calm. No, Rogers, there's nobody against you, and I'm not afraid of your figures either, much as I admire your skill. But we're both a bit nervous tonight, and I fancy some rest will do us good. Again, Rogers checked his guest's departure. Not afraid, eh? Then why are you so anxious to go? Look here. Do you or don't you dare to stay alone in here in the dark? What's your hurry? If you don't believe in it. Some new idea seemed to have struck Rogers, and Jones eyed him closely. Why, I've no special hurry, but what would be gained by my staying here alone? What would it prove? Only my objection that it isn't very comfortable for sleeping. What good would it do either of us? This time it was Jones who was struck with an idea. He continued in a tone of consolation. See here, Rogers, I've asked you what it would prove if I stayed. When we both know, it would prove that your effigies are just effigies, and that you oughtn't to let your imagination go the way it's been going lately. Suppose I do stay. If I stick it out till morning, will you agree to take a new view of things? Go on a vacation for 3 months or so, and let Orabana destroy that new thing of yours. Come now, isn't that fair? The expression on the showman's face was hard to read. It was obvious that he was thinking quickly, and that of sundry conflicting emotions. Malign triumph was getting the upper hand. His voice held a choking quality as he replied, "Fair enough. If you do stick it out, I'll take your advice. But stick you must. We'll go out for dinner and come back. I'll lock you in the display room and go home. In the morning I'll come down ahead of Orabana. He comes half an hour before the rest, and see how you are. But don't try it unless you're very sure of your skepticism. Others have backed out. You have the chance. And I suppose a pounding on the outer door would always bring a constable. You may not like it so well after a while. You'll be in the same building, though not in the same room with it. As they left the rear door into the dingy courtyard, Rogers took with him the piece of burlap, weighted with a gruesome burden. Near the center of the court was a manhole, whose cover the showman had lifted quietly, and with a shuddersome suggestion of familiarity, burlap and all, the burden went down to the oblivion of a coagular labyrinth. Jones shuddered and almost shrank from the gaunt figure by his side as they emerged into the street. By unspoken mutual consent, they did not dine together, but agreed to meet in front of the museum at 11. Jones hailed a cab and breathed more freely when he had crossed Waterloo Bridge and was approaching the brightly lit Strand. He dined in a quiet cafe and subsequently went to his home in Portland Place to bathe and get a few things. Idly he wondered what Rogers was doing. He had heard that the man had vast, dismal house in Walworth Road, full of obscure and forbidden books, occult paraphernalia, and wax images which he did not choose to place on exhibition. And now and then Roger would lead his guest. Orabana, he understood, lived in separate quarters in the same house.
At 11, Jones found Rogers waiting by the basement door in Southwark Street. Their words were few, but each seemed taut with menacing tension. They agreed that the vaulted exhibition room alone should form the scene of the vigil, and Rogers did not insist that the watcher sit in the special adult cove of supreme horror. The showman, having extinguished all the lights with switches in the workroom, locked the door of that crypt with one of the keys on his grouted ring. Without shaking hands, he passed out the street door, locked it after him, and stamped up the worn steps to the sidewalk outside. As his tread receded, Jones realized that the long, tedious vigil had commenced.
Others heard it too, and started nervously
So quoth
as the echoes
this raven,
through the great
my darlings, this is part 1. I will be doing part 2 next week.
And one of them,
We'll try and do more Lovecraft. We'll see how that goes. If you have any requests for my bedtime stories, you can leave them in the comments. You know, so many of you come to see my stories and yet aren't subscribed and haven't rung the little bell. If you would do so, it would certainly help me out. Thank you all for coming. You're always welcome at my chateau. And special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, and Tabby Cat.